Before you hear anything else, imagine this: a small city sitting quietly between giants, not competing, not shouting, just existing with a kind of silence that most people mistake for insignificance. But silence in places like this is never empty. It is full of stories that history never bothered to amplify. This is Sukabumi, a place that does not ask for attention, yet somehow deserves it more than most places that already have it. Tucked at the feet of towering volcanic guardians, Mount Gede Pangrango, Sukabumi breathes a different kind of air, cooler, softer, almost as if the mountains themselves filter not just the wind, but time itself. The kind of air that makes you slow down without realizing you are slowing down. The kind of place where your thoughts become louder because the world around you finally becomes quiet enough to hear them. And yet, this city is often reduced to a single line on a map, a stopover between Jakarta and Bandung, a place people pass through, not a place people arrive for. But what if that is the greatest misunderstanding of all? Because Sukabumi is not a corridor, it is a beginning. It is one of the smallest cities in West Java, covering only about 48.33 square kilometers. Small in size, yes, but size has never been the correct measurement of meaning. If it were, history would be a very shallow book. There are cities that expand outward, and there are cities that expand inward. Sukabumi belongs to the second kind. To understand this place, you have to go back, not just decades, but centuries. During the Dutch colonial era, Sukabumi was not just a name. It was a label used to describe two worlds at once. One part became what we now know as the city. The other stretched outward into the wider regency, both tied together by land, labor, and colonial ambition. The name itself first appeared in early plantation survey reports. A man named Andries de Wilde, a physician and plantation administrator working in coffee and tea estates, documented resting in a place he called Sukabumi in Kampung Jikole. Even in its earliest written form, the name already carried emotion. Suka meaning pleasure or joy, and Bumi meaning earth or land. A land that is liked, a land that is favored, a land that feels like it wants to be stayed in. And that is the contradiction of Sukabumi, a place shaped by colonial systems, yet named with a softness that feels almost poetic. By 1914, the Dutch East Indies government formally declared Sukabumi a city. But declarations do not always create life. For 12 years, it existed as a city without a functioning municipal government, a city in structure, but not yet in spirit. Only in 1926 did real governance begin, when Mr. G.F. Rambonnet was appointed as the first mayor. But even before that administrative identity settled, Sukabumi was already being shaped by another force entirely: agriculture, plantations, and the slow transformation of land into economic memory. If nearby regions were known for coffee plantations, Sukabumi became associated with tea. The highlands, the cool air, and the volcanic soil created conditions where tea plants could survive and eventually thrive. At first, cultivation was not perfect. The early attempts were inconsistent. But over time, something remarkable happened. Sukabumi tea began to reach European markets. Leaves grown in quiet Indonesian highlands were being consumed thousands of kilometers away in cities that had no idea where they came from. That is how global history often works. The origin is forgotten, the product is remembered. But Sukabumi is not only a story of colonial plantations and administrative milestones. It is also a city shaped by belief, by stories that are not always written down, but are always remembered. Every society carries myths, not because people are naive, but because myths often carry emotional truth where official records fail. One of the most famous stories comes from the area around Stadion Surya Kencana Road. There is a large black stone, irregular in shape, only about half a metre tall. Locals say it has existed for thousands of years. Some say it cannot be moved, not even with heavy machinery. During construction attempts, efforts were reportedly made to relocate it, but it remained in place. And then there are the stories. A giant headless snake seen by someone who passed by. A presence that cannot be explained, only remembered. But there is also another explanation, more grounded, more practical. The stone may have served as what local tradition calls a paku lembur, a village marker stone. When a new settlement is formed, a large immovable stone becomes a symbol of territorial identity. Not a mystical barrier, but a cultural anchor. Still, even explanations do not erase mystery, they only change its shape. Then there is Jalan Karamat in Gunung Puya, a road associated with the grave of a respected Islamic scholar known locally as Iyang Suryanagara. People say this was a man with karoma, spiritual excellence or miraculous blessing, and with him came a moral warning passed through generations. Do not speak harshly when passing this road. Do not bring disrespect into a place of reverence. Some believe consequences follow those who ignore this advice. Whether literal or symbolic, the message is the same. Certain places demand awareness. Certain places demand humility. And beyond the roads and stones, there is Curug Cikaso, a waterfall system with 3 distinct cascades, each flowing with its own identity. Locals and visitors often speak of unseen guardians. Again, belief and nature merge, not to scare, but to remind that nature is not something to dominate, it is something to respect. But if Sukabumi were only history and myth, it would already be enough to be remarkable. Yet it continues, because the present-day Sukabumi is full of quiet originality that most people overlook. Take the city's public transport. Angkot minibuses painted in bright colours, not random colours, but coded routes. Pink, purple, bright tones moving through the streets like living direction signs. In a world where public transport is often fading, Sukabumi's angkot system still breathes with personality. It refuses to disappear quietly. Then there is mochi, soft, chewy, familiar yet surprising. Most people associate mochi with Japan or China, but Sukabumi has its own version, deeply rooted in local adaptation. Some historical accounts even suggest that glutinous rice-based confections existed in Sundanese culinary traditions long before global commercialization turned mochi into an international dessert. In Sukabumi, mochi is not just food. It is memory wrapped in starch and sugar, a reminder that cultural exchange is not always one way. Sometimes it begins quietly in kitchens that history never records. And then there is the meaning of the city's name itself. Some say Sukabumi comes from Sundanese roots, suka and bumen, meaning a place where people like to settle, a place that feels comfortable enough to stay. Others trace it to Sanskrit, sukha meaning happiness, and bhumi meaning earth, a happy land, a joyful ground. Different languages, different eras, same conclusion, a place people are meant to feel at ease in. But here is the real question. If a place is defined as comfortable, why do so many people still only pass through it? Why do they not stay long enough to see it breathe? Because Sukabumi does not announce itself loudly. It does not force itself into travel brochures the way other destinations do. It does not chase virality. It waits. And waiting in the modern world is often mistaken for absence. But this city is not absent. It is alive in slow motion. It is in the morning mist that settles between mountains. in the sound of angkot engines starting another day, in the quiet reverence of roads that carry stories older than asphalt, in waterfalls that fall the same way they have fallen for centuries. And maybe the most important truth about Sukabumi is this: it does not need to become bigger to become more important. It only needs to be seen correctly. Because sometimes the most powerful places in the world are not the ones that shout the loudest. They are the ones that have been speaking softly all along, waiting for someone to finally listen. And if you stay a little longer in this story, you start to notice something strange about Sukabumi. It does not reveal itself in one moment. It reveals itself in layers, like a landscape slowly emerging from morning fog. Because beyond its history, beyond its myths, beyond even its identity as a quiet transit point, Sukabumi is a living system of everyday resilience. A city that does not perform for attention, but continues to function, evolve, and breathe in its own rhythm. Walk through its streets early in the morning and you will understand what that means. The air is still cool, shaped by its closeness to the highlands of Mount Gede Pangrango. Vendors begin setting up before the sun fully commits to the sky. The sound of metal shutters opening mixes with distant calls, engines warming up, footsteps crossing intersections that have seen generations pass through them. Nothing is staged here. Everything is routine. And yet, in routine, there is something deeply human. A quiet discipline of life continuing forward. That is the part most people miss when they only see Sukabumi as small. Small cities are often assumed to be simple, but Sukabumi is not simple. It is condensed. History here is not spread out like in massive metropolitan centers. It is concentrated, pressed into streets, markets, buildings, and memories that overlap each other. You can stand in one place and feel multiple eras at once. Colonial footprints beneath modern asphalt, plantation history beneath everyday commerce, old stories beneath new conversations. And this layering is not just historical, it is cultural, because Sukabumi is not frozen in time. It is constantly negotiating between what it was and what it is becoming. Modern transport systems still coexist with older forms of mobility. The brightly colored angkot network is not just functional, it is symbolic. Each color route is like a moving map of the city's personality, loud in design, but deeply organized in purpose. It is chaos that somehow understands itself. And in that same space, technology slowly enters. Smartphones, digital maps, online commerce. But it does not erase the old system, it overlays it. Sukabumi does not replace itself, it adds to itself. That is why change here feels different, not disruptive, but adaptive. Even its culinary identity reflects this balance. Take mochi again. In most places, it is treated as imported delicacy, something foreign, something globalized. But in Sukabumi, it has been localized so deeply that it no longer feels like it belongs to one origin story. It belongs to memory, a soft, elastic reminder that culture is not static. It is always being reinterpreted by the people who live it. And that is what Sukabumi does best. It interprets rather than imitates. Even its myths function this way. The stone at Stadion Surya Kencana Road, the stories of the headless serpent, the sacred tone of Jalan Kalamat in Gunung Puyu, tied to Iang Surya Nagara. These are not just tales meant to frighten or entertain. They are frameworks of respect. They teach behavior in a landscape where written rules are not always enough. In many ways, myth here acts like social memory, a way of reminding people that land is not neutral. It carries presence, it carries consequence, it carries meaning. And then there is nature again, always returning as the silent authority. Even when people try to define Sukabumi through urban development or administrative boundaries, nature refuses to stay in the background. The proximity to mountains, rivers, and nearby natural wonders continues to shape how life moves here. Not far from the city, waterfalls like Curug Cikaso echo that relationship between humans and landscape. Water falling in constant repetition, indifferent to time, yet deeply connected to how people experience time. Visitors come and go, but the water remains. And perhaps that is the underlying philosophy of this region. Everything changes, but nothing disappears completely. Even history here does not vanish. It transforms into narrative. From the early Dutch plantation systems that once defined economic life, to the tea cultivation that connected this region to distant European tables, Sukabumi has always been part of larger global movements. Yet it never lost its local core. Tea leaves grown in its highlands once traveled across oceans, but the soil remained. That is an important contradiction. Sukabumi has always been global without being loud about it. It participates in the world, but does not announce its participation. And maybe that is why it is often overlooked. Because modern attention favors noise. It favors visibility. It favors places that demand to be seen. Sukabumi does not demand anything. It simply exists with continuity. Even its size becomes part of its philosophy. At 48.33 square kilometers, it is one of the smallest cities in West Java. Yet within that compact space lies an intensity of life that larger cities often lose in their expansion. Bigger cities stretch themselves thin. Sukabumi concentrates itself inward, and that concentration creates intimacy. You do not just pass through Sukabumi. If you pay attention, you begin to feel like Sukabumi is passing through you. The rhythm of it stays, the air, the sound, the repetition of daily life, the mixture of myth and modernity, the quiet tension between being known and being unknown. And here is where the story shifts, because Sukabumi is not just about what it has been, it is about what it refuses to lose. In a world where cities constantly compete for attention, for tourism, for investment, for recognition, Sukabumi remains strangely uncompetitive in spirit. Not because it lacks potential, but because it does not define itself through comparison. It defines itself through continuity. And continuity is powerful in a way that is often underestimated. It means a place is not trying to become something else in order to matter. It already matters because it continues to exist as itself. So when people say Sukabumi is just a transit city, just a small city, just a quiet stop between bigger destinations, they are only describing what they see at the surface. They are not describing what it is like to stay long enough to understand it. Because if you stay, even for a short while, you begin to realize something subtle but important. Sukabumi is not waiting to be discovered, it is waiting to be understood. And understanding it requires a different kind of attention. Not the attention that searches for spectacle, but the attention that notices detail. The kind of attention that hears meaning in ordinary things. A moving angkot at sunset, a mountain silhouette behind rooftops, a street that remembers more than it says, a city that does not introduce itself loudly, but leaves an impression that lingers long after you have left. And maybe that is the final truth about Sukabumi. It does not try to be unforgettable, it simply is. And still, the deeper you go into Sukabumi, the more you realize something almost paradoxical. This is not a city that stays the same. It is a city that changes quietly without asking permission from attention. Because while its identity is rooted in history, mountains, and memory, its future is being written in very ordinary places, in classrooms where children learn without knowing they are inheriting centuries of layered geography, in small workshops where local businesses adapt to digital markets, in markets where older traditions of trade now sit beside modern payment systems. Nothing announces transformation here, it simply happens. And that is what makes Sukabumi difficult to categorize. It is not fully rural, not fully urban, not fully historical, not fully modern. It exists in between definitions, and that in between is exactly where its character lives. Even the landscape reinforces this idea. The city is shaped by its proximity to highland ecosystems and volcanic terrain, especially around the influence of Mount Gede Pangrango. That geography does more than create scenery, it creates behavior. The rhythm of weather affects rhythm of life. The cool air shapes architecture. The hills shape movement. The land itself teaches adaptation. People here do not live against the environment, they live with it. And that relationship between humans and landscape is one of the oldest stories Sukabumi continues to tell, even without words. But there is another layer too, memory. Because Sukabumi is not only built on land, it is built on recollection. Colonial era plantation history still lingers in subtle ways, not as something visible in every corner, but as an undercurrent in the story of tea and agriculture that once connected this region to global trade routes. At one point, tea grown in these highlands travelled far beyond Indonesia, entering European markets. That fact alone places Sukabumi into a global narrative that most people never associate with it. And yet, the city never became defined by that global reach. It absorbed it and kept moving. That ability to absorb without being erased is one of Sukabumi's most overlooked strengths. Even its stories and myths behave like memory systems. Take again the stone near Stadion Surya Kencana Road. To outsiders, it is just an unusual geological object. But in local understanding, it becomes a marker of presence, a paku lembur, a symbolic anchor of settlement. It represents something deeper than superstition. It represents how communities remember where they belong. Or Jalan Karamat in Gunung Puyuh, associated with Iyang Suryanagara. Whether interpreted spiritually or culturally, it functions as a reminder that certain places carry inherited respect. Behavior is shaped not only by law, but by belief. Even Curug Cikaso, with its 3 cascading waterfalls, becomes part of this memory system, a place where nature is not passive scenery, but an active participant in cultural interpretation. This is how Sukabumi stores meaning, not in monuments, but in stories that continue to circulate. And then there is daily life again, pulling everything back into the present. The iconic angkot system still moves through the city like a living circulation network. Brightly coloured routes turning streets into moving patterns of identity. It is not just transportation, it is urban expression. At the same time, modernisation continues to enter the frame. Digital tools reshape how people navigate, trade, and communicate. But instead of replacing older systems, they overlap with them. This overlap creates something rare in urban development, continuity without erasure. And food culture tells the same story. Mochi from Sukabumi is not just a dessert, it is a cultural adaptation that reflects how global influences can be reshaped into local identity. What begins as something foreign becomes something familiar. That transformation is not imitation, it is reinterpretation. and reinterpretation is one of the strongest forms of cultural survival. Even the name Sukabumi itself continues to reflect this duality, whether derived from Sundanese roots meaning a comfortable place to live, or Sanskrit meaning a joyful earth. Both interpretations converge on the same idea. This is a place meant for belonging. But belonging is not always obvious. Sometimes it is only understood after distance, because many people only realize the value of a place after they leave it. And Sukabumi, with its quiet presence, often reveals itself most clearly in absence. When the mountains are no longer in view, when the cool air is replaced by something heavier, when the rhythm of angkot routes is no longer part of daily movement, that is when the memory of the city becomes sharp, not loud, but persistent. And this is where the emotional truth of Sukabumi begins to emerge. It is not a city that demands admiration. It is a city that lingers. It stays in the mind like an unfinished thought, like a landscape you can still see even when your eyes are closed. And maybe that is why it continues to matter, even when it is not being talked about. Because importance is not always measured by visibility. Sometimes it is measured by endurance. And Sukabumi endures through history, through myth, through everyday life, through the quiet persistence of people who continue to live, adapt, and move forward within its boundaries. So when you reduce Sukabumi to just a small city in West Java, you are only describing its size, not its depth, not its memory, not its silence, not its continuity, and especially not its presence. Because Sukabumi is not trying to become legendary, it already is, in the only way that matters, not through recognition, but through existence that refuses to disappear. And even after all of that, Sukabumi still feels like it is holding something back, not in a hidden or secretive way, but in the way a place understands it cannot be fully captured by words, no matter how long the monologue runs. Because Sukabumi is not just layers of history, geography, myth, and culture stacked together. It is also silence between those layers, the silence of early mornings when the city has not yet fully woken up, the silence of mountain air drifting down from Mount Gede Pangrango, touching rooftops and streets like a reminder that nature is still in charge, even here. The silence inside small decisions made every day by people who choose to stay, to build, to continue, even when larger cities seem louder, faster, and more tempting. That kind of silence is not emptiness, it is stability. And stability is rarely noticed until it is gone. Sukabumi does not announce its importance because it does not need to defend its existence. It is already grounded in something older than recognition. You can trace it through time, from its early mention in plantation surveys during the Dutch East Indies era, when Andries de Wilde recorded the name Sukabumi in Kampung Jikole, to its formal establishment as a city in 1914, even if governance did not fully function until years later under Mr. G.F. Rambonnet, to its role in agricultural systems that once connected the highlands of West Java to global tea markets, where leaves grown in quiet soil ended up far beyond the horizon. But history alone is not enough to explain why a place feels the way it does, because history tells you what happened. It does not tell you what remains. And what remains in Sukabumi is atmosphere, a feeling that cannot be fully separated from geography, culture, or memory. It is in the way the streets feel slightly slower than the world around them. It is in the way the landscape still seems present even when it is not directly visible. It is in the way local stories, from the Black Stone at Stadion Surya Kencana Road to the reverence of Jalan Karamat in Gunung Puya continue to shape how people move through space. Even belief systems here are not distant from daily life. They are embedded into it, not as superstition, but as inherited awareness. A reminder that land is not just something to use, it is something to respect. And then there is movement again, pulling everything back into modern reality. Angkot vehicles, painted in bright colors, continue to define urban circulation, not as relics of the past, but as living infrastructure that still works, still adapts, still carries people from one part of the city to another. At the same time, digital life quietly expands over it. Maps, applications, online systems. A second layer of navigation added onto an older one. But Sukabumi does not experience this as conflict. It experiences it as overlap. Old and new do not cancel each other here. They coexist. And that coexistence is not always harmonious in a dramatic sense. It is simply practical. Life continues. Markets continue. Schools continue. Work continues. Rain continues to fall on rooftops that have seen both colonial and modern eras pass over them. Even Curug Cikaso, with its steady three-stream waterfall system, feels like a metaphor for this continuity. Constant motion, constant presence, unbothered by interpretation. People may attach meaning, myths, or spiritual narratives to it, but the water itself does not change its behavior for belief. It just continues to fall. And perhaps that is the most honest comparison for Sukabumi, a place that does not change its essence to match perception. It simply continues its own rhythm. Even its culinary identity, including its mochi tradition, reflects this same principle. Food here is not just consumption, it is cultural memory that can be tasted. Soft textures carrying centuries of adaptation, reinterpretation, and local creativity. What seems simple is actually accumulated history you can hold in your hand. And then there is the name again, Sukabumi, a word that has been interpreted as a place of comfort, a place of joy, or a land that is liked. No matter which linguistic origin you follow, the meaning converges toward the same emotional direction. This is a place that invites belonging. But belonging is not always immediate. Sometimes it only becomes visible after you leave, because distance sharpens memory. And Sukabumi has a way of becoming clearer when it is no longer directly in front of you. The mountains become more vivid in recollection than in sight. The air becomes something you realize you once took for granted. The movement of the city, the colors of its transport, the quiet rhythm of its daily life, all return in fragments that feel more meaningful the further you are from them. That is how certain places work. They do not impress you in the moment, they imprint you afterward. And so Sukabumi remains in that category of places that are often underestimated in real time, but deeply remembered later. Not because it overwhelms you, but because it stays with you. And that staying is its quiet power. Because in a world obsessed with visibility, speed, and constant attention, Sukabumi represents something different. A reminder that not everything important needs to be loud. Not everything meaningful needs to be trending. Not everything valuable needs to be constantly seen. Some places exist in a slower register, and that slowness is not weakness, it is depth. So when you think back on Sukabumi, do not think of it as a stop between bigger cities. Do not think of it as a small dot on a map. Think of it as a living continuity, a place where history did not end, where myth did not disappear, where modern life did not erase the past. and where silence is not absence, but presence in its most patient form. Because Sukabumi is not trying to be remembered, it simply ensures that anyone who passes through it will eventually remember. And if there is still more to understand about Sukabumi, it is this. The city is not only defined by what exists inside it, but also by how it shapes the people who move through it. Because Sukabumi does something subtle. It recalibrates perception. You arrive expecting something small, something quiet, something secondary to the larger names around it. But over time, your internal scale begins to shift. What you once called small starts to feel more like complete. What you once called simple starts to feel more like balanced. And that shift is not emotional exaggeration, it is observation. The more you sit with Sukabumi, the more you realize it is not lacking anything that defines a city. It simply expresses those things in a quieter volume. Its economy continues through layered systems of trade, agriculture, services, and informal networks. Its culture continues through language, food, belief, and memory. Its infrastructure continues through older transport patterns like angkot routes and newer digital layers that sit on top of them. Everything is present. Nothing is rushed. Even the landscape reinforces this sense of measured existence. The influence of Mount Gede Pangrango is not just visual, it is psychological. Mountains like these create a constant horizon that reminds people of scale. They reduce the illusion that human systems are the center of everything. When you live near something that large, you learn perspective without being taught. And Sukabumi is built inside that perspective. That is why even its myths feel different. The black stone at Stadion Surya Kencana Road is not just a story of something immovable. It becomes a symbol of permanence in a world where almost everything else changes. Whether interpreted as spiritual presence or cultural marker, it reflects the same truth. Some things are meant to stay where they are. Jalan Karamat in Gunung Puyuh, tied to the memory of Iyang Suryanagara, functions in a similar way. It is not just a road with a story. It is a reminder that movement through space is also movement through meaning. You do not just pass through places, you pass through inherited expectations of behavior, respect, and awareness. Even Curug Cikaso, with its 3 streams of water, reinforces this idea of layered reality. One location, multiple flows, multiple interpretations, all existing at the same time without contradiction. Sukabumi is comfortable with multiplicity. It does not insist on one version of truth when several can coexist, and that is rare. Because many places simplify themselves to become more legible to outsiders, they compress their identity into slogans, icons, or singular narratives. Sukabumi does not fully do that. Instead, it remains slightly complex, not confusing, but layered, and layers require time to understand. That is why Sukabumi resists quick description. Even its most practical identity as a transit city between Jakarta and Bandung is incomplete. Yes, people pass through it. Yes, it sits between major urban centers. But reducing it to that function ignores everything it carries internally. A transit point is something you leave. Sukabumi is something that stays with you after you leave. That distinction changes everything, because it means the city is not defined by movement through it, but by memory of it. And memory is a stronger form of presence than geography. You can leave a place physically, but you cannot easily leave it mentally once it has been properly experienced. That is why Sukabumi often reappears in thought at unexpected moments. In the middle of noise, you remember its quiet. In the middle of speed, you remember its slowness. In the middle of complexity, you remember its balance. And over time, those memories stop feeling like recollections and start feeling like reference points, a way of measuring other places, a way of understanding contrast, a way of noticing what is missing elsewhere. That is when Sukabumi fully completes its role, not as a destination, but as a baseline of perception. Even its name begins to feel symbolic in hindsight. Whether read as Sukabumi, a land that is liked, or as a deeper cultural interpretation of a place where people feel at home, the meaning becomes clearer only after experience. Because the word does not just describe the city, it describes the reaction people have to it after they understand it. And that reaction is often quiet, not excitement, not spectacle, but recognition. The recognition that this place, which once seemed minor, actually held a kind of quiet completeness that is difficult to find elsewhere. So when the story of Sukabumi is finally told in full, it does not end with a climax. It ends with understanding that Sukabumi was never trying to compete with larger narratives around it. It was simply maintaining its own, through history that never fully disappeared, through myths that still circulate, through landscapes that continue to shape behavior, through everyday life that never stopped adapting, and through a silence that has never meant emptiness, only continuity. And in the end, that is what remains strongest. Not the idea of Sukabumi as seen from a distance, but Sukabumi as something experienced, absorbed, and carried forward in memory. A place that does not ask to be remembered, but becomes impossible to forget once it has been truly seen. And even after all of this, Sukabumi still does not feel fully finished as a story. Because Sukabumi is not a closed chapter. It is an ongoing sentence, one that keeps being written in real time by people who may never realize they are part of something larger than their daily routines. A student walking to school under the cool shadow of Mount Gede Pangrango is not thinking about history. A street vendor setting up a small cart in the early morning is not thinking about colonial plantations or global tea routes. A driver navigating bright-coloured angkot routes is not thinking about urban theory or cultural layering, but all of them are participating in it anyway. That is how Sukabumi continues to exist, not as a concept, but as lived continuity. And if you look closely, you start to notice that the city does not actually separate its past from its present. It folds them together. Old plantation pathways have turned into modern roads. Historical settlements have become neighbourhoods. Traditional beliefs still shape how certain spaces are treated, even when new infrastructure surrounds them. Nothing is fully replaced. Everything is repurposed. Even its most modern developments still carry traces of older logic underneath them. The way streets are used, the way markets cluster, the way movement flows between districts. Urban life here is not a break from history. It is an extension of it. And that is why Sukabumi often feels difficult to fully categorize in simple terms, because categories require separation, and Sukabumi is built on overlap. Even its cultural identity resists singular definition. Mochi is not just a snack. It is a symbol of adaptation, where local taste, historical influence, and regional creativity merge into something that feels both familiar and specific to place. Angkot transportation is not just a system, it is a moving cultural archive, carrying patterns of social interaction, color-coded identity, and daily rhythm that cannot be replicated by standardized transport models. Even myths are not just myths. They are behavioral memory systems, ways of teaching respect, awareness, and restraint in environments where written instruction is not enough to shape everyday conduct. The black stone near Stadion Surya Kencana Road is remembered not because it is scientifically extraordinary, but because it anchors collective attention. It becomes a shared reference point for how space is understood. Jalan Karamat in Gunung Puyuh, associated with Eyang Suryanagara, continues to function as both geography and moral reminder, a place where movement is always paired with awareness. And Curug Cikaso, with its 3 cascading streams, remains one of the clearest examples of how nature in Sukabumi is never just background scenery. It is active narrative, constant motion that exists independently of interpretation, yet always invites it. But perhaps the most important layer of all is not visible at all. It is psychological, because people who live in or pass through Sukabumi often carry a subtle shift in perception afterward. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The memory of the place reorders how silence feels, how distance feels, how slowness feels, and even how home is defined. That is why Sukabumi tends to reappear in thought long after someone has left it, not as a specific image, but as a feeling of balance, a reference point for what a city can be when it is not constantly trying to exceed itself. And this is where its real identity becomes clear. Sukabumi is not trying to be a global symbol. It is not trying to be a major metropolitan headline. It is not trying to compete for visibility. It is simply continuing itself with consistency. And in a world that constantly rewards acceleration, visibility, and reinvention, continuity becomes something rare, almost radical, because continuity means refusing to disappear into trend cycles. It means remaining recognizable without needing reinvention. It means existing without performance. And that is what Sukabumi does. It continues, through time, through change, through modernization, through memory, through geography, through everything that moves around it. And even as the world outside grows faster, louder, and more fragmented, Sukabumi remains structured around something simpler: presence. Not attention, not spectacle, not scale. Presence. So when you finally step back and look at it as a whole, Sukabumi is no longer just a city in West Java. It becomes something else entirely. A reminder that not all importance is visible at first glance. A reminder that not all influence is loud. A reminder that not all places are meant to be understood instantly. And a reminder that some places are designed, almost unintentionally, to stay with you longer than they stay in front of you. That is the quiet, final truth of Sukabumi. It does not demand to be remembered, but it ensures that memory of it is inevitable. And once that memory forms, it does not behave like information. It behaves like atmosphere, something you do not just recall, but return to. And if there is still another layer left in Sukabumi, it is the one that cannot really be explained through history, myth, or geography anymore. It is the human layer, because at the center of everything, beyond the plantations, beyond the mountains, beyond the colonial records and local legends, Sukabumi is ultimately shaped by ordinary lives that keep choosing continuity over disruption. Families who have stayed for generations without needing to announce it. Newcomers who arrive for work or study and slowly find themselves adjusting their pace to match the city instead of forcing the city to match them. And those who leave but somehow keep returning in memory or sometimes in person, as if something about the place remains unfinished inside them. That unfinished feeling is important because Sukabumi rarely feels complete in the way big cities try to present themselves. It feels lived, and living things are never final. Even its relationship with time feels different. Time in Sukabumi does not always feel like something that is being chased. It feels like something that is being accompanied. The mornings do not rush to become afternoons. The afternoons do not aggressively turn into nights. Everything transitions but gently, and that gentleness shapes behavior more than people realize. You see it in how conversations happen in markets, in how movement through streets is rarely aggressive, in how spaces of nature like waterfalls, hills and river areas are approached with a kind of inherited caution, even by those who cannot fully explain why. This is where the influence of place becomes invisible but powerful. The presence of Mount Gede Pangrango is not just a backdrop. It is a constant reminder that human life is temporary, but landscape is persistent. And when a city grows under that kind of reminder, it develops a different psychology, less obsession with dominance, more awareness of scale, less urgency to conquer space, more tendency to coexist with it. Even Sukabumi's myths, when viewed from this perspective, stop being just folklore and start functioning as cultural memory systems that reinforce that coexistence. The black stone at Stadion Surya Kencana Road is not just a mysterious object, it is a symbol of permanence that resists human rearrangement. Jalan Karamat in Gunung Puya is not just a route with spiritual associations, it is a reminder that movement through space carries moral awareness. Curug Cikaso is not just a scenic waterfall, it is a continuous demonstration that nature does not need interpretation to remain meaningful. And the angkot system, with all its bright colours and local routes, is not just transport, it is a living pattern of how people organise movement in a way that is still deeply human, still locally intelligible, still resistant to full standardisation. Even modernisation here does not erase this human layer, it negotiates with it. Digital systems arrive, but they do not fully replace older rhythms. They adjust themselves around existing behaviour. They integrate rather than overwrite. That is why Sukabumi often feels like it is not being rebuilt. It feels like it is being extended. An extension is different from replacement. Extension means the original structure is still there, still guiding, still present. Even its economy reflects this same principle. It is not defined by sudden disruption or dramatic transformation, but by gradual accumulation. Small businesses, local trade, agriculture, services, and daily movement all contribute to a system that evolves without breaking its own continuity. Nothing in Sukabumi feels like it has had to erase itself in order to survive. And that is rare in modern urban development, because most cities grow by replacing. Sukabumi grows by layering, and layering creates memory density, which is why even a simple walk through its streets can feel like moving through different eras without needing a map. You are not just seeing buildings, you are seeing time compressed into place, and that compression is what gives Sukabumi its emotional weight. It does not overwhelm you with scale, it stays with you through detail, a colour of an angkot you remember later, a stretch of road that felt unusually calm, a mountain outline that appeared unexpectedly between buildings, a local story told casually but remembered deeply. These are not dramatic elements, but they accumulate, and accumulation becomes meaning. That is why Sukabumi does not need to insist on its importance. It builds it quietly, moment by moment, interaction by interaction, layer by layer. And eventually, that quiet construction becomes undeniable, because the more you try to reduce it to something simple, the more it resists simplification, not through argument, but through presence. So in the end, when all explanations are exhausted, when all history has been told, when all myths have been interpreted, and when all geography has been described, what remains of Sukabumi is something far less definable and far more lasting. A sense of continuity that does not depend on attention, a feeling of balance that does not depend on comparison, and a quiet assurance that a place does not need to be loud to be real. It only needs to continue being itself. And Sukabumi has never stopped doing exactly that. And even now, after everything that has been said, Sukabumi still feels like it is standing slightly outside the frame of its own story, because Sukabumi is not a place that fits neatly into an ending. It is a place that keeps extending beyond every attempt to define it, not because it is mysterious in a theatrical sense, but because it is complete in a way that does not require explanation to justify itself. It exists, and that existence is enough. Still, if you listen closely to how life unfolds inside it, you begin to notice one final pattern. Everything in Sukabumi moves in cycles, not straight lines. Morning returns with the same softness each day. Rain arrives with familiar unpredictability, yet never feels out of place. Markets open, close, and reopen in rhythms that feel less like schedules and more like breathing. Even people's lives here tend to follow a circular logic, returning home, returning to work, returning to familiar streets, returning to familiar faces. This cyclical nature is not accidental. It is shaped by environment, memory, and geography all at once. Because living near Mount Gede Pangrango means living under something that has not changed in human timescales, mountains do not rush. They do not compete. They do not reinvent themselves to stay relevant. They simply remain. And when a city grows in the presence of something like that, it quietly learns a different definition of time, not as progress alone, but as return. Even Sukabumi's identity as a transit point between larger cities like Jakarta and Bandung becomes part of this cycle. People pass through, but often without realizing that passing through is itself an experience that lingers. Because Sukabumi does not interrupt movement, it absorbs it, and later it returns as memory. That is why the city often feels more significant after leaving than while staying. While you are inside it, it feels normal, but once you are outside it, it begins to reorganize itself in your mind as something more structured, more meaningful, more layered than you first noticed. That delayed recognition is part of its design, even if unintentional. And it is not only geography or history that causes this, it is atmosphere. The combination of climate, scale, rhythm, and social behavior creates a kind of emotional imprint that does not fade quickly. Even simple things contribute to it. The color-coded angkot system moving through streets like a living network. The texture of local food like mochi, soft and familiar, carrying both local identity and external influence. The quiet persistence of myths that continue to exist not because they are proven, but because they are remembered. The stone at Stadion Surya Kencana Road that refuses easy explanation. Jalan Karamat in Gunung Puyuh that carries both geography and moral memory. Curug Cikaso that continues to fall without interpretation, as if reminding everyone that meaning does not always require language. All of these elements do not compete for attention, they coexist. And coexistence is the foundation of Sukabumi's identity, not dominance, not spectacle, not expansion, but balance. Even its smallest details contribute to the sense of balance. The way streets feel neither too crowded nor too empty. The way urban life and natural landscape remain constantly aware of each other. The way old systems and new systems overlap without fully replacing one another. Nothing here feels fully separated from anything else. Everything is connected through continuity rather than disruption. And that continuity is what gives Sukabumi its quiet strength. Because in a world that often defines success through speed, visibility, and constant reinvention, Sukabumi represents something different, a model of persistence without performance, a city that does not need to constantly prove it is alive because it simply continues to be alive. And maybe that is the final understanding, that Sukabumi is not a story that moves toward a climax. It is a story that refuses to end, not because it is unfinished, but because it is ongoing by nature. It does not conclude, it continues. And in that continuation, there is a kind of quiet certainty that no amount of explanation can replace. A certainty that does not need to be spoken loudly to be felt deeply. So when everything else fades into background noise, what remains of Sukabumi is not a headline, not a fact list, not a definition. What remains is a presence, subtle, steady, uninterrupted, and still, after all these words, still moving forward in its own rhythm, exactly as it always has. And now, even after this long unfolding, Sukabumi still does something subtle but profound. It refuses to shrink inside your memory. Because Sukabumi is not meant to be fully contained in understanding. It is meant to keep expanding in recollection. The more time passes, the less it behaves like a place you visited, and the more it behaves like a feeling you occasionally return to without warning. It appears in small moments, when the air turns cool for no clear reason, when a road feels quieter than expected, when movement slows just enough for awareness to catch up. And suddenly, without effort, Sukabumi returns, not as a map, but as atmosphere. That is the final transformation it creates in perception. It stops being there and becomes somewhere inside memory. Even its geography supports this lingering effect. The presence of Mount Gede Pangrango does not just shape weather or scenery, it shapes psychological distance. It creates a horizon that always feels near, even when unseen. A reminder that boundaries are visible, but also emotional.